Welcome to my fourth video lecture on anarchism for Philosophy 3200. This lecture is going to be about the problem of national defense, or societal defense as we might call it. The problem is, how can an anarchic society avoid being immediately taken over by foreign governments that have a military if they don't have their own government to defend them? Now, many people believe that it's impossible for a non-governmental group to defend itself against a governmental military. But this has been shown to be false by a number of historical episodes. So, for example, the experience of the United States in Vietnam. The U.S. military at the time was possibly the most powerful military that ever existed in the history of the world, at least one of the two most powerful militaries, the other being the Soviet Union. And yet, the U.S. military was defeated by rebels in Vietnam who were not themselves a government military. And they were defeated by these rebels who were engaged in guerrilla warfare using handheld small arms. The French had a similar experience in Algeria, the British in Ireland, and the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And these were all examples of some of the most powerful governments that ever existed. The United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France were probably the most militarily powerful governments that have ever existed in the history of the world, and yet all of them were defeated by guerrilla warfare. Now, an additional point to make is that occupying and controlling an ungoverned territory is more difficult than you might think. It's actually probably more costly and more difficult than taking over a territory that already has a government but that has a weak military. The reason for this is that if you wanted to conquer a large territory that was anarchic, you would have to conquer each neighborhood individually, one at a time, and then you would have to take the additional expense of setting up your own government in that area. The way that conquerors usually work is they just have to defeat the government of the other territory, and they don't have to set up a new government. Once they get the existing government of the territory that they're conquering to surrender to them, they then just use that government to collect tax money and do their bidding. And so they don't have to defeat every neighborhood. Once they get the existing government to surrender, then they're done. Another tactic is it turns out that nonviolent resistance has been surprisingly effective against governments. So if you consider things like the Indian independence movement, the American Civil Rights Movement, or the Solidarity movement in Poland, also consider the way that the Soviet Union collapsed circa 1990. So these were all cases in which an oppressive government was, let's say, convinced to stop being so oppressive by means other than violence. However, the main strategy for providing societal security is not actually to win a conflict with a foreign government. The main strategy is to avoid conflict. So to think about how we could avoid conflict, we first need to talk about why wars occur in the first place. So one theory is that wars are frequently fought over land and other resources. So for this reason, the first time a society does an experiment with anarchy, they should start it in a location that doesn't have a history of territorial disputes. So it makes a big difference where your anarchist society starts as to whether it will survive or not. Of course, if an anarchic society was started somewhere in the Middle East, it would immediately be taken over by a hostile foreign government. On the other hand, if an anarchic society was started, say, in Wyoming, unless it was attacked by the US government, no one would attack it. Also, you want to start your anarchic society in a place that doesn't have large concentrations of natural resources, such as oil, that other countries would like to take over. Okay, another explanation for why wars start is known as the conflict spiral. This is where there's kind of an escalating series of actions between two governments that are in conflict. One government does something that the other one doesn't like, and so the second government responds. And it can happen that the second government responds with something that's sort of more serious that the first government doesn't like. And then the first government thinks that they have to respond to that. And so you can get this kind of spiral where eventually it winds up in the most serious kind of conflict, a war. And the thing to notice about this is This is a danger, particularly if you have a government. This kind of conflict spiral cannot happen if you don't have a government. So that particular cause of war wouldn't happen in an anarchic society. Okay, another reason why wars occur is they're essentially fought over dominance between different governments. So a war will occur because the government of one nation wants to prove that they're more powerful than a neighboring government. Something like this was probably the cause of World War I and also World War II, i.e. the German government wanted to prove that Germany was more powerful than France or Britain or something like that. Part of the reason for thinking that this is the cause of war is wars are less likely between governments that have very different levels of power. So these kinds of wars break out between governments that are close in power. And this kind of war also would not occur with an anarchic society. The governments would be attacking other governments to prove that they're more powerful than the other governments. Many people believe that having a strong military is necessary to provide security by deterring other countries from going to war with you. But there's some evidence that indicates it might be the reverse. It's possible that having a strong military might actually raise the risk of war. Now, there's some empirical evidence on this. So social scientists who have looked at this have found there's either no correlation or a slight positive correlation between military spending and war. In other words, if your country is spending a lot of money on military, comparatively speaking, there's either no effect or it makes it slightly more likely that your country will go to war. One possible reason for this is having a lot of military spending kind of creates a war lobby. What I mean by this is there will be people who have an interest in the country going to war. Essentially, there are companies that supply the government during a war, and those companies become more powerful as your military spending goes up, and then they might use some of their money and influence to kind of get more aggressive politicians into power. Okay, another possible explanation is government leaders might behave more aggressively when they think that their country has a more powerful military, and that increasingly aggressive posture might make it more likely that your country goes to war. And a third explanation is other nations might perceive your nation as being more of a threat if you have a more powerful military. So these are all reasons why having a powerful military might actually increase your risk of going to war. Of course, the theory on the other side is that having a powerful military deters other countries from attacking you, so it makes it less likely, but the empirical evidence doesn't really show much effect. So it could be that these three factors increasing your risk counterbalance the deterrence factor. The empirical evidence also indicates that countries that have a large power difference are less likely to go to war with each other than countries that are close in power. So an example of this is the Iran-Iraq War. Initially, Iraq was much less militarily powerful than Iran, and then Saddam Hussein built up the military of Iraq. And once he had achieved rough parity with Iran, then Iraq went to war with Iran. And this war went on for several years and killed a lot of people in those countries. Empirical evidence also suggests that you don't necessarily have to have a military in order to be secure, because there are right now 15 nations in the world that actually have no military. Many of these are island nations. The largest of them is Costa Rica, which abolished their military after a military coup. They abolished the military in 1948, so it's part of their constitution that they don't have a military, and yet they still haven't been taken over in all that time. There are also many more nations in the world that have a military but a weak military, and one that's much weaker than some neighboring countries, and therefore couldn't plausibly be deterring more powerful countries from taking them over, i.e. there are many countries that could be taken over by other countries and they simply are not. And that is partly because, well, the other countries just don't have a dispute with these weaker nations. Okay, now another reason why you might be able to avoid conflict without having a powerful military is there's something called the liberal democratic peace. So social scientists have observed that liberal democracies either never or almost never go to war with each other. Liberal democracies frequently go to war with dictatorships, and dictatorships go to war with each other, but it's extremely rare for democracies to go to war with each other. There are some people who claim that it's actually never happened, but there are a few plausible examples where you could say that democratic countries were going to war with each other, but it's definitely much more rare. There are several hypothesized explanations for this. One explanation has to do with trade, because these countries are more likely to trade with each other extensively, and war will disrupt that trade, so it's not in their interest. Also, they just tend to share values. They have a kind of liberal set of values, which just makes it less likely for them to see each other as enemies. These countries are also much more prosperous, and therefore they have more to lose by going to war. And of course, because they're democratic, that means that the war will not occur unless it's very popular. And if you're living in a liberal and prosperous society, war is usually pretty unpopular, right? Because it tends to disrupt our comfortable way of life. It tends to kill people and destroy things and things like that. Right. So, and there's also been a trend over history towards more countries in the world becoming liberal democratic. So if you go back 200 years, there were essentially no democracies in the world. And by now, there's about half of the countries in the world that are democratic. So what it looks like is eventually the world will be taken over by democracy. So that would happen first. And then after all of the government-dominated societies in the world are democratic, then it's plausible that it would be possible for an anarchic society to arise and not be immediately taken over by its neighbors. Right? Of course, if an anarchic society arises next to a dictatorship, then it's much more likely to be taken over. But if you have an anarchist society that is just surrounded by liberal democracies, and there's no real reason why the liberal democracies would have a dispute with this anarchic society, which doesn't even have a government to have a dispute with, then the liberal democracies would probably leave them alone. Okay, now another kind of security threat that we should talk about is the threat of terrorism, which has gained prominence in the last couple of decades, especially in the United States. Many more people are worried about this than used to be. Now, terrorism has not claimed very many lives in the United States or elsewhere. It killed about 3,000 people on one occasion, and throughout the entire last 50 years, or in fact, throughout the entire history of the United States, it's killed around 3,000 people, a little bit more, maybe around 3,300 people or something like that. And that is many times lower than the number of people who've been killed by just ordinary non-terrorist murderers. So you might wonder why people are very concerned about this, but there is a cause for concern because there's a possibility of much worse terrorist attacks in the future. The people who are worried about terrorism the most, they tend to worry that there's going to be some kind of weapon of mass destruction attack where there might be chemical weapons or biological weapons or even a nuclear attack. So that's why we need to talk about that particular problem. Now, in order to think about how we should protect ourselves from terrorism, we first have to think about what causes terrorism. There are basically two popular views about this, about what motivates terrorists. The first is, you might call it the clash of civilizations theory. It's basically that terrorists are people who hate liberal democratic values. And this idea has been put forward by American presidents. So George W. Bush basically said after the 9/11 attacks that they hate our freedom and they hate our prosperity. The other major theory is the foreign policy retaliation theory. It's that terrorists are retaliating for specific foreign policies of the government. Now, which one of these theories is more plausible? Well, there's some empirical evidence suggesting the foreign policy retaliation theory. Basically, two important kinds of evidence. One is the statements of terrorists themselves. This seems like the strongest evidence because if you're engaged in terrorist attacks, you probably know what your motives are. And it would be in your interest to clearly explain those reasons because you're trying to terrify people into giving you what you want. So you have to tell them what you want. And if you look at the actual statements of terrorists, they cite specific foreign policies. So Osama bin Laden, the architect of the 9/11 attack, specifically said that the reason he was doing this had to do with the presence of U.S. troops in the Middle East, particularly in Saudi Arabia, as well as U.S. support for Israel. So the U.S. sends a certain amount of military aid to Israel as well as the government of Saudi Arabia, which bin Laden didn't like. The other piece of empirical evidence has to do with which nations get targeted for terrorist attacks. So there are a lot of liberal democratic countries in the world, but the United States is the most popular target for terrorist attacks. The United States also has a very interventionist foreign policy. We have hundreds of military bases around the world, something like 700. And we've spent tons of money and gone to war in the Middle East. We've had military presence in Iraq and Afghanistan for a couple of decades. And so that could explain why the United States is the main target for terrorist attacks. Okay, so that suggests that the government might actually be increasing our threat of suffering from terrorist attacks rather than protecting us. The government is probably creating more resentment with its anti-terrorism strategy, which basically has to do with sending military people over to the Middle East and bombing countries, doing drone strikes on people and things like that. That might be creating more resentment and thereby creating more terrorists in the next generation. There was a survey several years back of Muslims around the world which found that something like 37% of Muslims considered the 9/11 attacks to be at least somewhat justified. And that's hundreds of millions of people. And so the point I want to make is that if you have hundreds of millions of people around the world who hate you, your main strategy should be focused on reducing the extent to which people are angry and hate you. Okay, now fortunately, an anarchic government would not have this kind of interventionist foreign policy that makes people angry and makes people want to kill us. Now, all of the previous discussion has been about how we can protect ourselves from foreign enemies, but another thing that we should think about morally is the risk that we might be posing to other people, in particular the national security apparatus of the nation, if you have a government, might pose a threat to other people in other nations. The first threat is that the government might initiate unjust wars, and this is not an idle threat. There's, very, very good reason to think that this will continue to happen. It's very plausible that the U.S. government has initiated some unjust wars in the past few decades, which have killed hundreds of thousands, even millions of civilians. And just from a moral standpoint, you should think about that and think about how we should avoid that. Of course, a way of avoiding that would be not to have a central national government. The other threat created by the government is the government invents weapons. So most of the really powerful technology for killing people was actually invented by a government. There's exactly one technology that we know of right now that already exists that could plausibly extinguish the human species, that is nuclear weapons. And that, of course, was created by the U.S. government and has only been used by the U.S. government to kill people since it was invented. Okay, now our government and the governments of other nations that have powerful militaries is probably working on new weapons of mass destruction as we speak. They're probably researching, new, more effective, more powerful ways of killing people. I don't know how many of them would count as weapons of mass destruction, but basically if you have a very powerful organization spending lots and lots of money researching more effective ways of killing people, that creates a risk to the future. Not just from your own government possibly starting unjust wars, but once they invent new technology for more efficiently killing people and destroying things, that technology will get out. It's not plausible that only your country will know this, new military technology once you invent it. It's going to be discovered and then it will be in the hands of everyone else. So after the US invented nuclear weapons, the secret got out and the Soviet Union started building them. And there was a pretty good chance for the first few decades of the Cold War that the human species was actually going to be destroyed by nuclear weapons. There's a fair chance that will still happen. But we should worry that not just about nuclear weapons, but we should worry that we're going to develop even more powerful weapons in the future. And thus, we have a kind of moral obligation to minimize this threat to humanity and this threat to future generations. And one way that we could do this is to not have the people who are responsible for developing most of the really dangerous weapons and the people who have used these weapons and started wars killing hundreds of thousands of people already. Okay, so in conclusion, the government method of defending your society is too costly and too risky. It costs us a lot of money, but it also poses enormous risks to the rest of the world and to future generations. Also, a non-governmental method of defense is reasonable.